His mother grabbed Denise by the wrist in front of 200 people and told her to leave before she embarrassed herself any further. Her own husband just watched. The woman in red didn't blink. Denise didn't argue. She simply walked out and made one phone call. But before we get to that call, before we get to what was waiting on the other end of that line, we gotta go back. Back to the morning of the funeral. Back to the moment everything cracked wide open. The church was full. 200 seats, every last one of them taken. Fresh flowers lined the center aisle. White lilies, hand-picked, arranged the way Henry Caldwell would have wanted. Simple, dignified, no excess. Henry had been that kind of man. A deacon, a business owner, a father who said grace before every meal and meant every word of it. He ran a small contracting company for 32 years and never once cut a corner. His handshake was his signature, and his word carried more weight than any piece of paper ever could. The kind of man whose funeral brings out people who haven't spoken in years. Old friends, distant relatives, colleagues, who still remembered the way he showed up when nobody asked him to. Folks wore their best that morning. They spoke in low voices and held one another at the door. The grief in that church was real, and it hung in the air like perfume that had been sprayed too close. Denise sat in the front pew, hands folded in her lap, back straight, eyes fixed on the closed casket. She wore all black, a simple dress, a long coat, no jewelry except the thin gold chain she had worn since her wedding day. She loved Henry, not the way a daughter-in-law is supposed to love a father-in-law, out of obligation or good manners. She loved him because he was the only person in that entire family who ever made her feel like she was enough. When Warren's mother looked through her like she was glass, Henry looked right at her. When Warren forgot her birthday 2 years in a row, Henry was the one who called at 7 in the morning singing off-key and laughing about it. When Denise sat alone at family dinners while Gloria redirected every conversation away from her, Henry would lean over and say, "Tell me what you've been working on." He cared, not for show, for real. And now that casket was closed, and so was the only door that had ever been left open for her in that house. Warren sat beside her, but not close. There was space between them on that pew, not just inches, but something heavier, something that had been widening for years. He wore a charcoal suit and a face that looked more prepared than grieved. His jaw was tight, his posture was stiff, and his eyes, every few minutes, drifted to the third row. Denise noticed. She didn't turn around. She already knew who was sitting there. Simone, tailored red dress, black heels, hair pulled back in a way that said she had studied the room before deciding what to wear. She sat with her legs crossed, her hands resting on a small clutch purse, and her expression perfectly composed. Simone worked at Warren's firm. She had been around for close to a year now, and every time Denise encountered her, at company events, in passing at the office lobby, in the background of Warren's phone screen, she got the same feeling. Like watching someone slowly rearrange the furniture in your own home while pretending they were just passing through. The pastor finished the final prayer. People began to stand. Tissues pressed against wet eyes. Soft murmurs filled the room. That's when Warren rose from the pew, not to greet mourners, not to thank the pastor, not to shake hands with the men who had loved his father, but to address the room. He stepped into the aisle, tugged at the edge of his jacket, and cleared his throat. "I know today is about my father," he began, his voice steady, measured, controlled. "And I want to honor that. But I think he would have wanted honesty in this room. Denise and I have come to the end of our road. We'll be separating. I ask for your grace and your prayers as we both move forward." The room went still. Not the kind of still that comes from shock. The kind that comes when people are calculating, eyes shifted, heads tilted, 200 people trying to decide in real time who the victim was and who the villain was. Denise didn't move. Her fingers pressed deeper into the fabric of her coat, and if you were watching close, real close, you might have caught a faint tremble in her right hand. It lasted 1 second, maybe 2. Then it stopped. Gloria rose from her seat like she had been waiting for that exact moment. She placed one hand on Warren's shoulder and turned to face the congregation with the posture of a woman who had already decided the story she wanted told. "This family needs to heal," she said, her voice carrying a softness that was entirely manufactured. And sometimes healing means letting go of what doesn't belong. Every eye in that church turned toward Denise. She could feel it. 200 gazes landing on her like stones dropped from a high place. She could feel Simone's stillness from the 3rd row, radiating something that wasn't smugness exactly. It was certainty, the kind of certainty that says, I already know how this ends, and I've known for a while. Nobody spoke on Denise's behalf. Not one person in that church stood up. Not one cousin, not one aunt. Not one of Henry's old friends who had watched Denise sit by his hospital bed for 2 years, reading to him, adjusting his pillows, making sure he was comfortable when his own wife was too busy hosting brunches to visit. The silence was louder than anything Warren had said. Gloria walked toward Denise slowly, deliberately, the way someone walks when they want every person in the room to see what they're doing. She leaned down, wrapped her fingers around Denise's wrist, not rough but firm, and said just loud enough for the first few rows to hear, "Leave now, while you still have some dignity left." Denise looked up at her, not with tears, not with rage, not with the kind of brokenness Gloria expected to see. She looked at her with something quiet, something that lived deeper than words or reactions, or the performance Gloria wanted to provoke. And when Denise stood, she didn't yank her arm away. She didn't cause a scene. She rose slowly, adjusted her coat, and looked Gloria directly in the eye with a softness that made the older woman blink. "I always do," Denise said. Then she turned and walked up the center aisle, past 200 faces, past Simone in the red dress, past the lilies and the grief and the betrayal, all dressed up in Sunday clothes. She pushed through the double doors and stepped into the morning sunlight, and for a moment she just stood there, alone, the brightness hitting her face, the weight of that room still pressing against her chest, like a hand that wouldn't let go. Then she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed one number. When the voice on the other end answered, Denise said 5 words. "It's time. Move forward. Everything." She ended the call, slid the phone back into her pocket, and walked to her car. She didn't look back. Not once. Now, to understand what that phone call meant, to understand what Denise had been carrying this whole time, while every person around her treated her like she had nothing. You've got to go back. Way back. Before Warren, before Gloria, before any of it. Denise grew up in a small house on the east side of Ridgeway, North Carolina. Nothing fancy. Wooden porch with a creaky 3rd step, a backyard garden with tomatoes, collard greens, and a patch of sunflowers her grandmother planted every spring because she believed a house without flowers was just walls with a roof. Her grandmother's name was Cora. She raised Denise from the age of 6, after both of Denise's parents passed in a car accident on Route 17. Cora wasn't wealthy. She was a retired school teacher who lived off a pension that barely covered the electric bill and the groceries. But she carried something money couldn't purchase and hardship couldn't take, a mind sharp as fresh glass and a belief that preparation was the purest form of love. Cora taught Denise everything worth knowing: how to read a contract before you sign your name, how to keep a savings account nobody else knew existed, how to carry yourself in rooms that weren't built for women who looked like you, how to disagree without raising your voice, and how to leave without burning a bridge you might need later. She would sit on that porch on summer evenings with a glass of sweet tea and say things that didn't make sense until years later. "The world's gonna try to make you loud, baby. Don't let it. The woman who builds in silence is the one they never see coming." On the day Denise married Warren, Cora pulled her aside before the ceremony. The music was already playing. Guests were seated. Warren was waiting at the altar, but Cora held her granddaughter's hands and pressed a small cream-colored envelope into her palm. No name on the front, no decoration, just paper and weight. "Don't open this until the day you feel like you've lost everything," Cora said. Her eyes were serious but soft. Denise tucked the envelope into her jewelry box that night, underneath her pearls and beside her mother's ring. She figured she'd never need it. She figured love would be enough. The early years of the marriage were good. Genuinely good. Not just good in the way people say it when they're trying to find something kind to remember. Warren was different then. Softer, more curious, less consumed by the image he was trying to become. He laughed more. He asked questions he actually wanted the answers to. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment near the university while he finished his MBA. The place had thin walls and a kitchen so small 2 people couldn't open the refrigerator and the oven at the same time. Money was tight. They shared one car and took turns dropping each other off. They split groceries down to the dollar and celebrated Friday nights with takeout from the Chinese spot on Elm Street that gave extra rice if you smiled at the woman behind the counter. And most nights, Denise sat at a small desk in the corner of their bedroom, working on something she didn't fully explain and Warren didn't fully ask about. But sometimes late at night, he would bring her a cup of coffee and sit on the edge of the desk and watch her type. "Whatever you're building," he'd say, "I believe in you." He meant it back then. She could hear it in his voice. And those words, that version of him, were the ones she would carry long after the man who said them disappeared. But somewhere along the way, Warren changed. Or maybe he didn't change. Maybe he just grew into the version of himself his mother had always been shaping. Gloria had never approved of Denise, not her background, not her quiet manner, not her refusal to perform wealth she didn't have. Gloria wanted a daughter-in-law who mirrored her own ambitions, polished, loud, socially strategic, the kind of woman who wore her husband's success like jewelry. Denise was none of those things. She was depth without decoration, substance without performance. And Gloria resented her for it in a way that never softened with time. As Warren rose in the corporate world, as the titles got longer and the offices got higher, his admiration for Denise's quietness turned into suspicion, then indifference, then something that looked a lot like contempt. He stopped asking what she was working on. He stopped bringing coffee. He started spending more time at the firm and less time at home. And when he was home, the space between them felt like a room neither of them wanted to enter. Denise would cook dinner and set the table for 2, and Warren would eat standing at the counter, scrolling through emails like sitting down across from his own wife was a meeting he couldn't justify attending. She stopped asking about his day, not because she didn't care, but because every time she asked, the answer got shorter. 1 word, 2 words, a grunt, a shrug, until eventually the silence between them became the loudest thing in the house. And Denise realized something that took her a long time to admit. She wasn't losing Warren. She had already lost him. What remained was just the shape of a marriage without the substance. And through all of it, every cold dinner, every canceled plan, every evening spent alone while Warren attended events he didn't invite her to, Denise kept building, quietly, patiently, alone. She attended a clean energy conference one year, sat in the back row of a panel discussion, and listened to a man named Terrence break down the economics of sustainable infrastructure in Black communities. His voice carried the kind of conviction that doesn't come from rehearsal. It comes from belief. After the panel, she introduced herself. Terrence was a sharp, principled attorney who had spent 2 decades funding minority-owned infrastructure firms. He looked at Denise the way Henry used to, like he could see the thing inside her that nobody else had bothered to look for. He handed her a business card and said, "When you're ready to stop building in the shadows, call me." She took the card. She didn't call for 2 more years, but when she did, everything started moving. Now back to the present, after the funeral, after being pulled from that church pew in front of 200 people. Denise drove to the apartment she had been staying in since Warren told her to leave the family home 3 weeks earlier. It was half empty, a couch with a blanket folded over the arm, a small kitchen table with 1 chair, a suitcase she still hadn't fully unpacked sitting in the hallway, like it wasn't sure if it should stay either. And on that table, still sealed after all these years, sat Cora's cream-colored envelope. Denise looked at it every morning and every night. She hadn't opened it. She wasn't ready. The weeks that followed the funeral moved slow and heavy, like walking through dark water with no bottom in sight. Warren acted fast. His attorney sent divorce papers within 10 days. Cold, clinical, stripped of any acknowledgement that a real marriage had once existed between 2 real people who said real vows and meant them. The settlement offered Denise a small lump sum and no claim to property, investments, or anything built during the marriage. No credit for the years she worked to support his education. No recognition of the 2 years she spent caring for his dying father while his own mother was too busy performing grief for an audience. The message was clear and deliberate. You leave with nothing because you were nothing. Gloria made sure the social narrative matched. She moved through her circles with the efficiency of a press secretary, rewriting history at lunches and phone calls and church gatherings. She told anyone who would listen that Denise had been financially dependent for the entire marriage, that she had contributed nothing of substance, that Warren had carried her for years out of kindness, and the separation was a long overdue correction. "It's a mercy, really," Gloria said one afternoon at a luncheon, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. That girl never had the backbone for this family. Simone, meanwhile, operated with surgical precision. She never publicly declared herself as Warren's woman. She didn't need a title to occupy a position. Her method was subtler and more effective than any announcement could be. Late-night phone calls where she told Warren he deserved a partner who matched his ambition. Quiet dinners at restaurants with low lighting and long wine lists, where she listened more than she spoke, making Warren feel like the most important voice in every room. She framed Denise not as someone who had been wronged, but as someone who had been quietly holding Warren back from reaching his full potential. And Warren, whose ego had been steering the ship for years, absorbed every word like dry ground takes water after a long drought. One night, alone in his home office after one of those dinners, he opened a drawer and found an old photograph of Denise. She was young in the picture, smiling wide, rain on her shoulders, standing outside their first apartment the day they signed the lease. Something stirred in his chest, not clear enough to call guilt, not sharp enough to call regret. Just a heaviness. The ghost of a man he used to be standing in the same room as the man he had become. He stared at the photo for a long time. Then his phone buzzed on the desk, Simone's name on the screen. He laid the photo face down in the drawer and picked up the call. Meanwhile, Denise was being erased. Not violently, not dramatically, just methodically, the way you erase a name from a whiteboard, one pass at a time, until there's nothing left but a faint shadow nobody acknowledges. Friends stopped reaching out. She was quietly removed from the planning committee of a community gala she had helped organize for 3 consecutive years. No phone call, no explanation, just her name missing from the next email chain, like it had never been there. Her name was taken off the church volunteer roster. Invitations stopped arriving. One by one, the threads connecting her to the world she had known were being cut, not with violence, but with silence. And silence, when it's used as a weapon, cuts deeper than any words ever could. One evening, one of the last people still speaking to her, a woman named Lorraine, who had known Denise since before the marriage, sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "Why don't you just tell people the truth? Why don't you fight back? Why are you letting them write your whole story for you?" Denise opened her mouth, paused, then said quietly, almost like she was talking to herself, "Because the truth isn't ready yet." Lorraine looked at her like she'd just watched someone wave a white flag. She took it as surrender. She took it as defeat. It was neither. But there was a night, one particular night, when it almost broke her. She was sitting on the kitchen floor, not crying, not screaming, not throwing things or calling anyone or doing any of the things people expect you to do when your life has been pulled apart at the seams. She was just sitting, her back against the cabinet door, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes staring at the wall across the small kitchen like it might have an answer written on it somewhere if she looked long enough. The tremble came back, the same tremble from the church pew. Her hands shook, her breath got short and shallow, and in the stillness of that empty apartment, with no one to hear and no one to see, she whispered, "Grandma, I don't know if I can keep being quiet." Nobody answered. The apartment stayed silent, but the silence that followed her words wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that sits beside you and waits, the kind that comes right before something inside you either collapses completely or transforms into something it has never been before. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. Warren's legal team had frozen their shared bank account. Whatever small access Denise still had to joint funds was now sealed shut. On paper, on every piece of paper anyone could find, Denise now had nothing, no visible income, no assets anyone could trace, no support system, no voice. The portrait was complete, at least the portrait everyone else had been painting. That evening, Denise sat at the kitchen table and looked at Cora's envelope. She picked it up, turned it over in her hands, ran her thumb slowly across the seal, the way you touch something sacred before you open it. And this time, slowly, carefully, like she was unwrapping a prayer, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, written in Cora's careful, steady hand. The words were simple. "Don't ever let someone else's opinion of you become your truth. Build quietly, move when it's time." Denise read it once, then again. The second time something shifted behind her eyes. Not anger, not fire, not the hunger for revenge that would have made this story easier but cheaper. Just clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives when you finally stop asking the world for permission to be who you already are. She stood up from the chair, pulled her phone from the counter, and called Terrence. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's finish this." Now, here is what nobody in Warren's world knew, what nobody at that funeral knew, what Gloria and Simone and every person who had quietly unfriended Denise and uninvited her and erased her name from their lists did not know. While they were all busy deciding she was nothing, while Gloria was rewriting history over crab cakes and white wine, while Simone was whispering ambition into Warren's ear, like oxygen into a dying flame, while Warren was signing divorce papers like he was discarding an old subscription, Denise had been building something that would rearrange the entire landscape they were all standing on. 6 years earlier, after that first real conversation with Terrence, Denise had quietly co-founded a clean energy infrastructure firm called Monarch Energy Solutions. Not a startup running on optimism and a pitch deck, a real company, structurally sound, legally airtight, built with her own separate savings, strategic mentorship from Terrence, and partnerships she cultivated over years of careful, relentless, invisible work, while everyone in her life assumed she was just a housewife with no ambition and no direction. The firm specialized in large-scale sustainable energy projects, solar grids, wind corridors, community battery storage systems designed to bring reliable, affordable power to neighborhoods that had been overlooked and underserved for generations. It was serious work, meaningful work, the kind that doesn't make noise until the ground beneath your feet starts to shift and you realize someone built the foundation while you weren't paying attention. The company was solely in Denise's name. It had never appeared on any joint filing. It had never been disclosed as a marital asset. Terrence had structured everything from day one to ensure that what Denise built would be protected from exactly the kind of man Warren was becoming, and from the kind of family that would try to claim credit for what they never supported. Over 6 years, the company didn't just grow. It became one of the most respected clean energy firms in the entire southeastern United States. Contracts with municipalities, partnerships with federal agencies, a reputation that opened doors Denise never had to knock on twice. And on the morning of Henry's funeral, the very same morning, Gloria wrapped her fingers around Denise's wrist and marched her toward the door like she was taking out something that didn't belong. Denise's firm had been awarded an $18 billion federal infrastructure contract, the largest clean energy deal in the region's history, a deal that would power communities, create thousands of jobs, and reshape the energy map for the next 30 years. Denise had planned to delay the final signing out of respect for Henry, the only man in that family who had ever looked at her and seen someone worth believing in. She wanted to mourn him properly. She wanted to give grief its space before business took over. But when that church door closed behind her, when the morning sun hit her face and the silence of the parking lot replaced the silence of that congregation, she made the decision. She called Terrence, and the contract was signed that same afternoon, while Warren was shaking hands at the repast, while Gloria was accepting condolences she hadn't earned, while Simone was adjusting her red dress in the bathroom mirror. Denise was putting her signature on a document worth more than everything that family had ever touched, combined. Nobody knew. 3 weeks later, the city's annual Economic Development Summit was held at the downtown convention center. It was the kind of room where power doesn't whisper. It walks in, sits down, and waits for someone to say something worth listening to. Corporate leaders, politicians, investors, journalists, federal officials, the people who decide where billions flow and whose name goes on the building. Warren attended because Simone's firm had secured a small exhibition booth in the hall, and he wanted to be seen in the right room. Gloria came because she never missed an opportunity to wear her pearls around people who noticed. They arrived together, Warren in charcoal, Gloria in cream, Simone 2 steps behind in designer heels, and took seats near the middle of the auditorium. They settled in like they had earned those chairs, like they had always belonged. The lights dimmed. The moderator walked to the podium and welcomed the crowd. He talked about growth, about infrastructure investment, about the future of sustainable energy in the region. Then he said a name that made the oxygen leave Warren's lungs. Please welcome the founding partner of Monarch Energy Solutions and the visionary architect behind this region's largest clean energy initiative, a contract valued at $18 billion. A woman whose leadership will reshape infrastructure for the next generation, Denise Caldwell. Warren didn't gasp. He didn't flinch. His hands, resting on his thighs, just stopped. Like the signal between his brain and his body had been severed in one clean cut. Gloria's fingers tightened around her clutch purse until her knuckles shifted color. Simone's carefully composed expression cracked just for a second, and then she dropped her gaze to her lap like she had been struck by something invisible. Denise walked onto that stage the way morning light enters a dark room, unhurried, inevitable, and impossible to look away from. She wore a tailored black suit, minimal jewelry, no flash, no revenge wardrobe designed to send a message. She didn't need sequins or stilettos or a neckline that made a statement. She looked like authority, not the kind that needs to announce itself or perform for approval, but the kind that simply arrives and the room rearranges itself around it. She stood behind the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the audience. She didn't scan for Warren. She didn't search for Gloria's face in the crowd. She didn't glance at Simone. She simply began to speak. "I was raised by a woman who had nothing the world would call valuable," Denise said, her voice steady and warm and clear. "No wealth, no connections, no influence as people usually define it. But she gave me something no one has ever been able to take from me. She taught me that the loudest room doesn't belong to the person who shouts the most. It belongs to the one who is patient enough to build the floor everyone else is standing on." The room went still. Not the polite, obligatory stillness of corporate courtesy, the real kind. The kind that happens when someone says a truth that lands in your chest 3 seconds before your mind catches up. She talked about the contract, about the communities it would serve, neighborhoods where families paid too much for electricity that went out too often, where children did homework by candlelight, not by choice but by circumstance. She spoke about clean energy not as a corporate trend or a political talking point, but as a justice issue, power and light for people who had been left in the dark for too long. She talked about what it means to build something meaningful with your own hands, while the people closest to you tell you those hands are empty. She never raised her voice. She never pointed a finger. She never said Warren's name or Gloria's name or anyone's name. She didn't have to. Every word she spoke was a mirror held up to that room, and somewhere in the middle section, 3 people saw their reflections more clearly than they ever had before. Warren sat through the full 45-minute presentation without moving. He didn't get up. He didn't check his phone. He didn't lean over to whisper to anyone. He just sat there, perfectly, terribly still, as the full weight of what he had discarded settled over him like wet concrete drying in afternoon heat. The woman he had dismissed. The woman his mother had dragged by the wrist out of a church. The woman he had let walk out alone into a parking lot. She was standing on a stage in front of the most powerful people in the city, and she was the reason every single one of them was in that room. Gloria's face didn't crumble the way it does in movies. It just went blank, completely, utterly blank. The kind of blank that comes when the entire story you've built your identity around, your superiority, your judgment, your certainty that you knew who belonged and who didn't, collapses so fully there's nothing left to arrange your face into. The woman sitting beside her leaned over and whispered, "Isn't that your son's wife?" Gloria stared straight ahead. She didn't answer. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. When the presentation ended, the room rose. Not a polite, scattered standing ovation. A real one. The kind that begins in the back of the room as a murmur and builds forward like a wave, row by row, until the entire auditorium is on its feet, and the applause isn't for courtesy, but for conviction. Denise thanked the audience, stepped away from the podium, and walked off stage without looking at the middle section. Not once. She didn't need to. In the parking lot afterward, Simone walked beside Warren in silence. Their footsteps echoed against the concrete. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Simone stopped, turned, and faced him. Her voice was flat, not cruel, not kind, just precise, the way she had always been. "I think I need to focus on my own career for a while," she said. She didn't wait for a response. She turned, walked to her car, opened the door, and drove away. The sound of her heels clicking against the pavement faded into nothing. Simone wasn't destroyed. She wasn't punished by some dramatic act of karma. She simply looked at the situation the way she had always looked at everything, with calculation, and she stepped off a sinking ship before the water reached her ankles. That was who Simone always was. Precise, practical, loyal to nothing and no one but her own trajectory. She wasn't evil. She was just empty in the places where loyalty was supposed to live. The unraveling that followed happened the way real consequences always do. Not in a single cinematic explosion, not in a public screaming match, not in some dramatic courtroom scene, but in a slow, quiet erosion that leaves you standing in the same spot, watching everything around you recede like a tide going out and not coming back. Warren's professional world shifted first. No one made an announcement. No one called a meeting. People just stopped returning his calls. Lunch invitations disappeared. Meetings were rescheduled and then never rescheduled again. Business contacts who once sought his opinion now avoided eye contact at industry events. He became known simply and permanently as the man who divorced Denise Caldwell right before the contract. And in boardrooms and golf courses and the quiet spaces where reputations are decided, that kind of story doesn't need a press release. It just hangs in the air every time someone says your name, like an odor no one mentions but everyone notices. He wasn't fired. He wasn't publicly shamed. It was worse than that. He was simply made irrelevant, passed over for promotions he was once guaranteed, left off email chains he used to lead. The corner office he had been promised went to someone younger, someone hungrier, someone who didn't carry the weight of a story that made people uncomfortable at dinner parties. Gloria's fall was quieter and in many ways more devastating. The women she had lunched with for decades, the same women she had spent years performing for, impressing, competing with, began to pull away. Not dramatically. A declined invitation here, an unreturned message there. A table at a charity dinner where her usual seat had been reassigned to someone younger and quieter and less interested in being impressed by Gloria's stories. One of those women, a longtime associate named Francine, said at a gathering Gloria was not invited to. Imagine throwing out the most powerful woman in the room and not even knowing it. Gloria heard about the comment secondhand, through a cousin who hesitated before repeating it. It didn't anger her. It hollowed her out. She sat alone in her living room that evening, the same living room where she had hosted dozens of dinner parties and holiday gatherings and congratulatory brunches. And for the first time in her life, the room felt too big for just one person and too quiet for someone who had spent a lifetime filling silence with performance. There is a difference between being opposed and being irrelevant, and Gloria was learning, slowly, painfully, with no audience to perform for, that the second one is infinitely worse. Warren sat alone one evening in his home office, the same room where weeks earlier he had laid Denise's photograph face down in the drawer and answered Simone's call instead. The house was quiet. Simone's number was no longer in his recent calls. Gloria hadn't phoned in days. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that lives in a house after everyone has decided you aren't worth visiting anymore. He opened the drawer. The photograph was still there. He picked it up with both hands and held it under the lamplight. She was smiling in the picture, rain on her shoulders, standing in front of their first apartment the day they got the keys. She looked happy. She looked whole. She looked like someone who believed in the man standing behind the camera. He didn't cry. That would have been too clean, too cinematic, too much like a story. He just sat there holding the photograph, feeling the slow, full, suffocating weight of everything he had chosen and everything he had lost by choosing it. He placed the photo upright on his desk, not face down, not hidden, just standing there in the lamplight, like a monument to a mistake he would carry with him for the rest of his life. 6 months passed. Denise's home wasn't a mansion on a hill. It was a craftsman-style house on a tree-lined street, warm, sunlit, filled with books and green plants and framed photographs of Cora and Henry, and the people who had loved her when loving her wasn't popular. The kind of home that feels like someone's soul arranged into rooms. Cora's letter was framed on the wall behind her desk, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of suffering, as a compass, a direction she could look to any time the world tried to tell her she was less than she knew she was. She was reviewing blueprints for a new community development project, affordable housing powered entirely by Monarch Energy's clean grid, the first development of its kind in the region. 300 units, families who had been on waiting lists for years, children who would finally have bedrooms with heat that didn't cut out in February. She signed documents, returned calls, made decisions that would shape the daily lives of thousands of families who would never know her name, but who would feel warmth in their homes and light in their children's bedrooms because one woman decided to build something that mattered more than revenge ever could. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window. Outside, the trees along the street swayed gently in the late afternoon breeze. A woman pushed a stroller on the sidewalk. A neighbor waved from across the yard. The light came through golden and soft, the same way it had that morning outside the church. But her hands weren't trembling this time. Her breath didn't catch. She just stood there, still whole, unbothered, unhurried, watching the world she had rebuilt from the inside out. Denise didn't win because she got rich. That needs to be said out loud and said plainly. She won because she never let their cruelty rewrite her story. She built in silence. She moved with intention. And she let the truth speak when it was ready. Not a second before and not a second after. She didn't scream at that funeral. She didn't drag Warren's name through the mud online. She didn't call reporters or post tearful videos or beg anyone to see her side. She walked out of that church with her chin up, her hands steady, and her grandmother's wisdom stitched into the lining of her coat. She made one phone call, and she quietly, permanently reshaped the entire landscape, while every person who dismissed her was still celebrating her exit. That evening she opened a small drawer in her desk and pulled out a piece of ivory stationery. She sat down and wrote a short note. Not to the world, not to the press, to Warren. It wasn't vengeful, it wasn't cold. It wasn't a lecture or a list of grievances or a final argument. It simply said, "I hope you find what you were looking for." She folded the note carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote his name across the front in clean, steady letters. Then she paused, held it in her hands, looked at it for a long, quiet moment, and placed it back in the drawer, unsealed, unsent. She didn't need him to read it. Writing it was enough. Some words aren't meant for the person they're addressed to. Some words are just the last breath of a chapter. You are finally, completely, peacefully ready to close. The house was quiet. The evening light was fading into gold, and Denise sat there in the peace she had earned, not given, not stolen, not inherited, not handed to her by anyone who suddenly felt sorry, earned. Every silent night on that kitchen floor, every trembling hand pressed flat against a coat to keep from shaking. Every moment she chose patience over fury and strategy over spectacle and dignity over the satisfaction of proving someone wrong before the time was right. It all led here, to a woman sitting in her own light, in her own home, needing nothing from the people who once tried to convince her she was nothing, and finally, completely free. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that silence isn't weakness and patience isn't surrender, then share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see your own journey. I'll see you there.